there's a very subtle change in the negligence standard. We're going to go from a standard of negligence for auto accidents from a modified comparative negligence to a pure comparative negligence basis. Since no fault went into place, we've been a modified comparative negligence state. And what that basically says is that, look, as long as you're not greater than 51% or more at fault, and there are other criteria regarding bodily injury that they had to meet, that if the other party was greater than 51% or more at fault in that accident, you had no legal obligation. There was no liability attached to you. Once the other party was 51% or more at fault, they lost their ability and they lost any recourse they had against you to sue you. Well, now that's not true, and you could be deemed only 10% negligent, and if the courts now have determined that that value of that lawsuit is $20 million because the person that you've been involved in the accident with is a highly valued or a highly compensated person with a lot of dependents, and you now have a $20 million judgment, even though you were only 10% negligent in that loss, under a pure comparative negligence basis, the court will say that you're still legally liable for 10% of those damages and $2 million. So this is a huge change and has a tremendous impact on the fact that if you can now be sued, not only can you now be sued for things that you couldn't be sued in the past, the potential cost of those is almost completely unpredictable at this point. You do need to think seriously about what your liability limits are going forward, especially after July 2nd. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is personal umbrella coverage is remarkably inexpensive. It's not really pricey. So buying $1 million or $2 or $3 million of excess over all of your other liability coverage is actually remarkably inexpensive. It's, people are sometimes shocked as to how cheap it is. One of the things that we can never answer, while we can quantify certain things, right? So for example, if you tell me I've got a house or you tell me I've got a building and you give me square footage and dimensions and when it was built, I can get you pretty close to what's it going to cost to replace that. Maybe not spot on, but I can get you pretty close. The one area that we can never answer that question is how high should my limits of liability be? If you're going to be concerned about limits, it's liability. It's always going to be liability because you can never quantify, no agent can, no attorney can, no CPA can, none of us can quantify exactly what your exposure is until we go to trial. Once you've gone to court, then the court and the jury then, assuming it goes to a jury or rather than a bench trial, then the court's going to determine what your liability is. And they're going to tell you what the dollar value of that is. And we can't tell you, it's very unpredictable, we can't tell you how much coverage you need until we go to court and we walk out of that trial. And then it's too late to buy any coverage, right? Because you can't buy coverage for a loss that's already occurred. If you've got further questions about the concept of either modified comparative negligence or pure comparative negligence, if you want to talk about umbrella coverage, we're always glad to answer questions. Call our office, send us an email, but call us. We'd be glad to answer questions, talk about what your costs are, what your exposures potentially are. We'd be glad to walk you through all those issues.